up next.
Yes. It's always tough to follow Corey because he's such a great storyteller.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You got this.
All right. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining and spending an evening learning about all our projects. My name is Laura Asher Pope, and I'll be talking about my thesis project tonight, which I'm calling Taxonomy of Dance. Hopefully you'll figure out why throughout the rest of the presentation. But before I dive in, I'll briefly introduce myself. My educational background before this graduate program is in electrical engineering and fine arts. But in the past 5 years, I've been doing mostly data science work and some software development. Currently, I work at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, where I do a lot of user interface development and design and data visualization design and development. So most of the day, and then after most of the workday in this program, it was Python all day and JavaScript all day. But I learned a ton in this program, and I wanted to thank C-Todd and Amy, who's in the other room, unfortunately, just for the time they spent to help us along in the process. So I'll just dive in. This project is about dance, and the reasons for that are kind of twofold. The first is I love dance. I've always been really interested in it, and I kind of grew up in a house that loved dance. My mother is a dancer and a dance teacher. And while at this point in my life, I don't dance anymore, and unfortunately haven't been able to attend many performances during the last year because of the pandemic, I really wanted to focus on something that I was passionate about and that I loved for this final project, because I knew I would need something that I was excited to work on because it was going to be a long couple of months. And so I mostly was drawn to this because I was curious. It was born out of curiosity of like if I would be able to treat choreography as data at all. And if I did figure out a way to do that, how would I try to visualize it without a dancer performing the steps? Because really at the end of the day, I kind of think of a dancer performing choreography as visualizing that choreography. They're bringing something that is, a symbol on paper into a visual format, the one it's intended to be in. So the couple of questions that I asked myself throughout this project were, first of all, would I be able to do this? How would I do it? And then if I figured out how to do it, how would I create kind of a visual signature for a dance based on its choreography that would be unique from other dances? So that visual kind of fingerprint, like Corey was talking about, was something that I was really interested in and curious about throughout this project. And that kind of drove my visualization process. And then secondly, could I create a visualization paradigm from which I'd be able to infer characteristics about the dance? So, not just to create something that is visually pleasing, but can I actually get information without watching the dance, from this thing? Like, would I be able to see different rhythm patterns? Would I be able to pick out different body symmetries that the choreographer had chosen? And then I was also really interested in this kind of intersection of like computational techniques and analysis on humanities. So if I did find a way to create these data, could I perform analysis on it and eventually find trends in dance? Like, could I find geographic trends or time trends or anything like that? So these were the questions that really drove a lot of my process. So to address the question of, could I do this? How do I do this? I did a lot of research, I think probably back in the summer, like August or so. And eventually I discovered the most promising thing that I found was this digital archive of scanned choreography maintained by an entity called the Dance Notation Bureau, which I think is up in Brooklyn. And basically they have a couple hundred of scanned choreography notations just publicly available on their website. And this was great, but the only problem was these notations were recorded with a method that's called Laban notation. And I'll talk a lot more about that later on in the presentation, how I dealt with that problem. But this was enough for me to say, okay, this is probably something I can do. So now I want to jump actually all the way to the end of my process and just show you the end result that I ended up with, because I think it will be easier to have this idea or to have this image in your heads throughout just to follow along with the rest of the presentation. So in terms of inspiration, as I said, I did a lot of researching just to see if anyone had did anything similar before I really got down to work. And I found a couple of repositories on GitHub that did something like along the same line or similar, but not exactly. One of them was that I found really interesting was this group that had built a machine learning classifier for folk tales. So basically they trained this classifier on a bunch of different texts from different folklore in the world, such that if you would present it with the body of text of a folktale it hadn't seen before, it would be able to tell you, hey, this came from Norway, or hey, this came from the cultural tradition of Ghana or something. So as I said, that combination of computational technique and humanities was really interesting. In terms of visual inspiration, something early on that I thought a lot about was calligraphy, because it was kind of aligned with what I was trying to do, which was representing the history of a movement, visually. And that's kind of what calligraphy does. It's recording the movement of a hand that's holding like a brush pen or a pen with ink. So that was, imagery that I referred back to a lot throughout the process. And similarly, a couple other things that I had in the back of my mind was this artist, Remy Charlip, who was a choreographer and an artist. And he would create these things called airmail dances, which were just drawings of different movements. And then he would send them out to different dance companies around the country and say, hey, all you have to do is fit these movements somehow in a dance. And it was his way of like collaboratively choreographing. And then this last image on the right is, I think, from Zan Armstrong, who was actually a guest speaker early on in our program. And the thing I really like about this is it's using a lot of little things to create, a big shape. And you'll see, similarities. I just really am aesthetically drawn to this way of presenting data. So moving on to the audience and the why of this project, like who would be interested. Primarily, as I said, it was a passion project for myself, so I was the audience. And what really drove the process was, what am I most curious about, kind of in looking at this data from a different perspective than I've seen before. So that was the biggest driver of how I decided to do things. But then secondarily, I think if I approach this data in a different way, it could be presented kind of in a gallery context as fine art. And then thirdly, and part of also where I would like to take this project in the future would be to present it to choreographers themselves and dancers themselves, maybe to experience, the art form that they devote their lives to in a different way, just from a different perspective. So to actually bring it back to the source of the data. And moving on to the why, I think primarily what I was trying to do was to create something novel that firstly drew people in from a sense of delight, so that they would then, once they were immersed and invested in the presentation of the data, they could then explore and then learn more about, dance itself. Maybe, someone who would not have ever been interested, in classical ballet would now be, have their interest piqued and do further exploration. So those are my intentions and goals overall. But then moving on to actually, what I built and how I built it, I mentioned that the choreography data set that I found, well, it wasn't even really a data set when I found it. It was just a collection of images. They all looked like this image here. And this is the method of notation, Laban notation that I mentioned. And really, it's a type of symbology that represents movement. So each of these different shapes corresponds to a different element of movement. So it contains which body part was moved, what direction the body part was moved in, and the height the body part moved, as well as the length of the movement. So one of the biggest problems and most interesting challenges, I think, in this project was how do I translate this into something that's machine parsable that I can use to build a visualization? And going back to that GitHub repository that I mentioned that built a classifier, one of my goals in this project was to learn a little bit more about machine learning. And so I really wanted to train a classifier that would be able to take in this image and label each box and say what type of movement it was. So that was initially my goal, but I quickly realized after a couple of weeks of doing that and talking to some coworkers that task could easily have taken up the entirety of the time that I worked on this, just in terms of how much data you would have to label, and then how much testing and training you would have to do. So I realized that was out of scope and moved on. But the thing that I got out of that trial was this labeling software. So this is a Microsoft product called VOT, V-O-T-T. I don't know what it stands for, but it's widely used to label training data sets for training classifiers. And I eventually realized, I don't need to train something to do this. My data set can be as large or as small as I want it to be. So I really can just manually label these myself. And so that's what I ended up doing. And it was kind of a happy accident. But the output of this software is pretty clean. It's a CSV. So, it seemed like a natural choice to just use this to create my data. And what I ended up doing was downloading all of the images or the PDFs of the dances I was interested in investigating. And then I ingested them into this software and created all of these colored bounding boxes that you see in this image. And then I came up with a labeling scheme that would contain all of the information I needed about the movement. So that would be body part, movement height, and movement direction. And so really then it became just a process of labeling all the data I needed. And this was a long process. So it was something I was doing throughout the course of the thesis process, always labeling data. And I think at the end of the day, it was over like 1,500 of these little bounding boxes that I created, but it was worth it. And the output of the CSV that came out of this contained these fields down here, the X coordinates of the box and the Y coordinates of the box, and then each of those labels. So from here, it was just a matter of processing that data to get it into a format that I could start to explore visualization paradigms with. So I wrote a bunch of Python scripts that just took this in and then, interpolated from these images, basically turned them into time, actually as these movements occurred within the dance. So I had to interpret from coordinate to time, which was interesting. And really just create fields that I could start to experiment with. So this top image is kind of the intermediate in between from the labeling software output and then some simple statistics that I performed on top of this, which is below. So those statistics included some things I was interested in investigating about in the dances. So those were how many movements happened per measure, and a measure in the choreography is a lot like what a measure is in like a musical staff. So it's just a number of beats, either 4 beats or 6 beats or 8, depending on the dance piece. But I looked at how many movements happened per measure, the number of unique movements per measure, the number of unique movement directions per measure. And then I created these 2 indices from those statistics, those 3 statistics I just mentioned. So the first one was a repetition index. And this was a way of characterizing a measure characterizing how repetitive a measure was. And really, it was just the number of unique movements over the total number of movements. And then I inverted that so it would be more intuitive. So the higher that index, the more repetitive a measure. And then I created a directional diversity index, which in my mind is a way of saying basically how much the dancer turned around in a measure. So it's seeing how many unique directions were used over how many total directions were recorded in the choreography. So once I had created all of these statistics and indices, I wanted to go back to my original goal of seeing, can I create a classifier with this, or how would that work? And so I did a lot of experimenting with plotting all of these measures in different feature spaces, because the whole point of a classifier is to try to find a feature space where the points that you're plotting will separate themselves into distinct clusters. And then you can, when you get a new point in, you can say, oh, it's closest to this cluster, it belongs to this set. So that was the motivation for creating these plots. So each point here that's a different color is a measure, and each plot is showing a different dance that I was looking at. And really, you can see, there's nothing distinct that's happening. It's all kind of in the same space. So this wasn't really panning out anywhere. And I think if I did have more time, this would be something I'd be interested to continue, but it would just take a lot more data than I had the time in this project to label. So it was interesting. And this is another feature space that I tried, and each of these patches is a different dance. And really they overlap a lot, and the feature spaces that I chose were not best and weren't working out. But I had done all this work in trying to find a way to create a classifier that I really wanted to find how I could use this work in the final product. So what I ended up doing was creating these boundary outlines of the different clusters that each dance had produced, because I think these shapes, they better fit the tone of the eventual piece that I created, which was more about, like I said, creating delight and kind of a playfulness. And they still do tell you something about the characteristic of a dance, because you can look at a shape and see, if it has more weight over here, that means the measures within that dance are more repetitive, because the x-axis is that repetition index I mentioned, and the y-axis is that direction diversity index I talked about. So you can get a sense of where the weight in that shape is, of where in that space the measures of the dance lie. So you still do get a sense, and it's more of an illustrative tool that I ended up using this work for. So talking about the main product, trying to find that visual signature for each dance, I'm going to talk about the steps of visualization that I went through. So the very first thing I did was to create this dashboard that I'm showing here. It was really quick with this Python library that already existed. And the goal here was to try to explore the data and see if any stories jumped out, that I could build a narrative around. And the answer that I got from this was not so much. What you're seeing here at the top are all of the movements in a piece of dance, color-coded by the body part they're using. And then at the bottom, again, are some simple statistics, like how much of each height was used in the dance, and how about direction, and then weight distribution. But I pretty quickly scrapped this because I wasn't seeing anything stand out here. And this top part I thought was not a good way of showing a dance, because it's really hard to pick up on rhythm here. As you traverse along the x-axis, you kind of forget what happened before. So that got me thinking, well, what format can I use to get that sense of a dance's rhythmic patterns? And the answer to that question was to try a radial format. And this was kind of my first attempt at doing that, where time is moving from the center outward. So these circles here represent movements that happened, the first movement of the dance is here, and then as you go outward, the dance progresses in time. And at this point, I thought it would be intuitive to kind of lay things out like anthropomorphically. And so I made these angular spokes that would anchor these points in time to which part of the body was used. So, this is the head, this is the hand, left arm. This is a torso movement and so on. And really the only thing I liked about this was the radial format. As I experimented more with this technique of laying things out radially by body part, I kind of realized it wasn't going to achieve that visual signature because most dances tend to favor the feet and the arms just by nature. So this wasn't really an answer to that. And I just didn't like this way, I didn't like how it looked. It was kind of clunky. So kind of the eureka moment was when I switched out the angular spokes from representing a body part to representing the direction that a dancer moved. So what you're looking at here is each radial line is a movement in the choreography. And when a spoke occurs, that means, when it aligns radially with a direction, that means the dancer made a movement in that direction, and the height of the spoke corresponds to how long that movement took, basically. So I was really happy visually with this, and it kind of did achieve what I wanted in terms of being able to see those rhythmic visual patterns, and then also being able to convey direction a dancer moved and the body part, because I could isolate different radials that corresponded to different body parts and just show those one at a time. So overall, this kind of accomplished what I was getting at. So once this was complete, it really became a matter of what do I want to do with this? What kind of story do I want to create for this project? And I knew I wanted to do something web-based just because the scope of the project, it was kind of too short to make anything physical. And it just kind of fell in place that I would create like some kind of digital essay. So then it became a matter of, where's the narrative? How should I partition this data in a way that makes sense? So I considered, nationality of choreographer, time period that the dance occurred in, or some kind of aspect that popped up in the analysis of the data itself. But like I mentioned, when I was attempting to build the classifier, no trends really became apparent. It was, probably a matter of my data set being too small to really make any, see anything that globally was true about dance. So at the end of the day, it made most sense to choose a partition to present the data that already existed. So, that ended up being historical dance periods. And the two periods of dance that presented the most visual contrast, and I think the most visual interest, turned out to be the classical period of ballet, which is basically just the 1800s, the 19th century, and then contemporary dance, which began in the 1950s and then is still performed today. So once I kind of decided, okay, I'm going to take a time view of this data and then build a narrative around that, it was a matter of structuring that narrative in a way that these kind of complicated visuals would be understandable, but still present, an enjoyable experience where a reader would want to explore the data and, spark new interest. So this table of contents is what I ended up going with. And then something I also want to mention is one thing early on that in the class we had before CTADS was kind of like pre-thesis. Our teacher, Amy, kept prodding me like, well, how can you create a visualization that conveys the sense of a dance kind of without showing the dance itself, which I always wanted the visual to stand on its own and not, correspond to a video of the dance or whatever. So I kept trying to think of how can I how can I like convey the flavor of the dance in these? And originally I was thinking I would accompany them with illustrations that showed like the costuming that was used originally in the dance, or just create an illustration of some characteristic movement or choreography of the dance. But what I ended up going with was a suggestion of one of my cohort mates to use the score of the dance and create an animated playback. So that's what I ended up doing. So the way I structured this was I introduced the essay with kind of a reading guide of how do you look at this visual, how does it work? And then as a way of priming, I'm showing a table of contents just to show the reader what to expect instead of presenting it without any warning. And then I basically go through this 3-part view of each of the 2 eras that I was looking at. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing this screen and break into a demo. So this is the website that the digital essay I created lives on. I ended up hosting it on Heroku because it's pretty easy and it's free. But basically what I used to build this is the Flask Python web framework. And then a lot of the design work is done in Illustrator, and the visualizations are built in D3. So this is the title page, and I have this kind of invitation to this is what this project is about. Scroll down to learn more. And then I present the reader with these 2 questions, kind of the questions that drove the curiosity that led me to create this in the first place. And then, like I mentioned, this is the reading guide of here's what to expect, how do you interpret it? And then I actually link to the methodology presentation as well from this page if a reader is interested in seeing how this was created. And here's the table of contents I mentioned. So my goal here is to prepare the reader for to understand that I'm looking at this data from the partition of 2 different eras. So just expect that. And then I'm trying to present kind of when you see this horizontal layout, what it's representing is a dance's movements isolated by body part. And then I'm saying, hey, when you see these 3 radials, don't forget to click the play button because that's what I think one of the most interesting parts of this piece. So then I start with the most recent era first, which was the modern and contemporary era. And I have this timeline on the side to kind of create kind of awareness of this is when the era took place, but this particular dance is from this point in time. And then, as I mentioned, here are each of the 3 dances featured in each era. And I'm just going to play, sorry, I have to take out my headphones for this. Play one of each of the dances from each era. So then I follow this with kind of an overview. So I'm showing each of the 3 dances broken out by body part, and then also accompanying with these measure characterization pictures that I touched on. And what I'm doing here is inviting comparison. So I'm trying to ask the reader, look at these, do you see any trends that pop out? Or even, do you see any anomalies that will encourage future exploration? Like, oh, this dance, made heavy use of the arms in the second part. I kind of want to see what that looks like or learn more about the choreographer who made it. And then this three-part structure of each era continues with the classical era, which, as I mentioned, is in the 1800s. And just to give you a sense of what this might look like, I'll play one more. So same approach as before. And the very last thing I do is show basically all the dances in summary and invite the reader to really look at, do you see any trends here? So this is the final summary view of the piece, and I point out a couple notes that I think are interesting over here. And that really is all I have for tonight. Thanks for listening along the journey, and I guess it'd be a good time for questions.
That was a fantastic presentation. I love the website layout. I love everything about this. And I think it's a fantastic use of audio and animation at the same time. I have one question, and you may have already addressed this, and I apologize if I missed it. But during the animations, there were on the lines, there were points that were added onto them. And I'm sorry if you already explained this, but could you tell me what those are again?
Yeah, no, you didn't miss anything. So that was something I'm kind of trying out with, or playing with, and didn't incorporate because I'm not sure if it really belongs in the piece. So I didn't incorporate it into the how to read this visual, but these dots are the cumulative average, you can think of it, of the weight distribution of the dancer as the piece progresses. So most of them, as you can see, like start facing front with most of their weight forward. And then some of them, like this one, kind of lean, to one side, but for the most part, most of them don't veer too much from that forward, like centered weight. And I also noticed an interesting thing I noticed in some of them is there's more symmetry. So the cumulative weight distribution will, stay pretty centered because it gets evened out by movements from the left and the right. So this was more of an exploratory thing, and I apologize for not pointing that out. But yeah.
No, but that's an exciting way to add even one more element to this. So that's at the very least is a great test.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
JT, any questions or comments from you?
Okay. I believe you said my name, so I'll just pipe in. I have only the most humble of questions because that's really captivating. It's just wonderful how you've incorporated all these pieces together. When you start, have you always kind of coded Python and there really wasn't any assumption that you would use anything else for this project?
Yeah, that was kind of the reason. I'm really comfortable with it, and so it was kind of the easiest way for me to clean and get the data in the format that I wanted it. So yeah.
And when we look at the color scheme on this website, in terms of how else would you go away from just the black and incorporate color in each of these pieces?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did play around with adding color, like as a way of highlighting different things. Originally, I was looking at making like an interactive interface where a user would click, let me see the arm movements, and then it would color those arm movements. But I felt like it took away from kind of the delicacy that I wanted the piece to have because it was related to dance. And for me, dance is something that's delicate. So yeah, I think for this instance in particular of how, of what I created with the data, it felt a bit distracting. And so that's why I ended up going with this kind of muted scheme. Yeah.
Yeah, and more of a comment than anything else. I think of like the local Irish step dancing companies and just the kind of the contrast that would present if you were able to have some sort of data. Contrast that with something with a lot of movement with upper body. But
yeah,
wonderful.
Yeah. That would be interesting. Yeah, I also wanted, another thing to do if I had all the time in the world would be to investigate different folk dances because, those tend to be really repetitive and, how would those fall in this scheme that I created on, in that space of repetition and direction diversity, they'd probably stand out a lot. So yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. It's just been a privilege to hear this.
Sure. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, Laura, great work. It's really awesome to see the evolution of this. As a kid, as younger, I was a avid Lindy Hopper thanks to my grandmother, who was one of the original Lindy Hoppers back in the day. Yeah, I'm curious about like, could you apply? You think you could apply this same framework to lots of other dances? And what do you think that might do to the shapes, or how might you have to evolve the project to accept other or multiple other forms of dance?
Yeah, the thing that was really more exciting than creating this website itself was that of like, what else can I do with this in future work? Because really, I felt like I created a process more than like a piece at the end of the day. As a way of turning choreography data into something I could analyze. So yeah, I don't really know how I would change it, to take in different types of dance until I were to see it, and see how it affects the shape of the visualizations themselves.
Cool. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. You've established almost this way of analyzing and interpreting dance that you could apply to a lot more things. Super interesting. So you almost built a product here that could be like just add other different types of input of obviously you need the codification of the dancing, but still really interesting. I'm wondering, like, my product brain's going like, well, we've got computer vision. You could take some videos, run them through some computer vision, codify them a certain way, then get into your Python scripts, and so.
Yeah, I went like process crazy in this. I just loved all the little challenges that it presented. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Cool. All right. Any other questions or comments from anyone else? All right. It is just about 9 past the hour.